Good afternoon, dear students, alumni, and guests. My name is Professor Grażyna Rębielak, and on behalf of Warsaw University of Technology Business School, I warmly welcome you to today's inspirational lecture. I would like to welcome students and alumni, of course, from our university, Warsaw University of Technology, and in particular from Business School, but also very warm welcome to all our partners, our guests, in particular from the University of Salford in Manchester, BMI Executive Institute in Vilnius and Brussels, Goa Management Institute from India, HEC in Paris, Management Center in Innsbruck, Polimi Graduate School of Management Politecnico di Milano, Sheffield Hallam University, and the Zicklin School of Business, Baruch College, New York City University. Today, the inspirational lecture will be delivered by Dr. Stephen Kelly, who is representing Salford Business School, the University of Salford, Manchester, United Kingdom. Dr. Kelly is a senior lecturer in supply chains, procurement, and project management with 15 years of teaching and research experience at a range of academic institutions, and previously worked for over 10 years in industry in various supply chain management roles for companies like, for example, Siemens, GEC, and the NHS. His research interest includes negotiations, gender-responsive procurement, the use of artificial intelligence, and circular procurement sourcing. Today, he will deliver a lecture entitled A Critical Exploration of Bargaining in Purchasing and Supply Management, as you can see on the slide. I would like to also take this opportunity before we start with this lecture to invite you to the next inspirational lecture, which will be delivered on 15th of May by Ms. Sandra Bichl from our school with the topic Leveraging AI and Technology in Your Job Search. Now I want to wish you a good time with Dr. Kelly and, of course, encourage all of you to ask him questions on chat, but after the lecture, okay? Stephen, you are more than welcome to start your lecture. Have a great time.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Krasnia. So a very warm welcome to everybody, and it's an absolute pleasure and an honor to be able to present my research into bargaining and negotiation in conjunction with the Warsaw University of Technology Business School. So as was previously mentioned, I've got a mixed background. So I spent about 12 years in industry, where I started out as a trainee buyer for a large telecoms company, and through various other purchasing and supply chain management roles. And one of my final roles was I was a corporate procurement manager at Siemens, which is a company I'm sure you're all very familiar with. And then I've worked for about 15 years in a variety of academic roles where I teach and research into purchasing and supply management and also supply chain management. So in today's session, which my talk will take about 30 minutes, and obviously it'd be great to get questions from you through the chat at the end. But this research is based on a paper that I had published along with my colleague, Professor Dan Chicksand from the University of Birmingham in the UK. And I put the full citation of the paper there. At the end, there's a slide that has the link to the paper, so it's open access. You can read it, and I'll also copy the link into the chapter into the chat at the end. I think obviously we've got a mixed audience in terms of people who are attending. So I think I hope it's interesting at two levels. So the first one is it's a systematic literature review. And obviously, as students, depending on where you are in your current studies, doing literature reviews is often a key part of your dissertation or your final project. But it's also interesting because it's looking at an area that's very valuable as a skill set. So negotiation and bargaining. So obviously my background in procurement and purchasing and supply management, where we were negotiating and buying from suppliers. So that's the perspective I've taken from this. But of course, in terms of working in sales or marketing, you're still negotiating. And indeed, internally, while some of the factors may not be directly relevant, there's some elements that may be relevant. For example, if you're working in projects, having to negotiate tasks or completion of activities. So I'm just going to start out with some relatively brief context. What do we mean by negotiation? And also, what was the purpose of our research? And I think that's particularly important for literature reviews, is to have a clear purpose for what you're doing, rather than just describing what the academic literature is saying about a particular phenomenon. It's actually, this is what we're trying to research into. In our case, it was to explore what we saw as fairly sometimes contradictory, but also very fragmented definitions of what was meant by bargaining. Then I'll talk again fairly briefly about the research method and approach. We followed a fairly standard systematic literature approach before I'll spend a bit more time in the more interesting aspects discussing the findings and the development of our model, and then also finishing up with some recommendations for practice and also future research. So a really valuable output from a literature review is, what can future research do? Not obviously just myself or Dan in this case, but future researchers who are interested in exploring some of the elements around negotiation bargaining. And then the final element is just in terms of the dissemination, where we've presented this research, and also what we plan to do and continue to do as well. So thank you very much for attending. I hope you find it useful and insightful. So what do we mean by negotiation? And negotiation is everywhere. So we're always doing negotiation. I teach a lot of negotiation. I use a lot of interactive role plays, for example, with negotiation, ranging in level from school children all the way through to executive MBA students, other master's students, and also into practice and industry. And I think one of the things is, because we're used to negotiating in our personal lives, in our social lives, as students, in other workplace settings, is that some of the ways that we experience negotiation, we often try and use those in those more commercial settings. But in essence, the top bullet point there, so it's an interpersonal back and forth communication. So that's either involving individuals or groups of individuals or multiple individuals within organizational settings. And what they're trying to do is to communicate, to try and come upon an agreed upon decision. And one of the challenges with negotiation, of course, is that those objectives, those requirements, are often oppositional. And again, we can all picture a traditional price-based negotiation that takes place. I want to buy a product, supplier wants to sell it to me, and we're negotiating over a price. And of course, price is important, but it is often only one of those either variables or objectives from a negotiation. From a business to business setting, which is the area that I'm focusing on in this discussion and also in the research, it's an absolutely integral part of business activity. So within a wider supply chain management context, and it is a bit of a cliche to say that it's not organizations that compete, it's their supply chains that compete. And certainly what we've seen very recently, obviously with the new set of tariffs coming from the US, a lot of that discussion and those challenges relate to supply chain issues. So organizations are, to varying degrees, very dependent upon their supply chains and their suppliers. So obviously I'm biased because my background is in procurement. I research into it. And indeed, we've seen the increased strategic importance of procurement. And as an example of that, so when I worked for Siemens, which is probably 20 years ago or so, and now one of the first of those larger companies to create a chief procurement officer role, because Siemens were very forward thinking and understood the need to have a strategic focus on their procurement activities. But of course, it's not just about goods. So organizations also have requirements for services as well. One of the rationale for our research was to try and understand a bit more about what we mean by negotiation strategies. And this is a really traditional way of thinking about negotiations. If you get virtually any textbook on negotiation, it will have some element of this. A lot of the research has some element of this as well. And what this is saying is there's two very, very broad strategies. So one that we probably associate more traditionally with negotiation, which is called distributive or adversarial negotiation. And the underlying premise of that is I win, you lose. I want to take the maximum value from that negotiation. And if we put that in a price context, as a buyer, I don't want you as a supplier to make any profit from this deal or this negotiation that we've used. Now, some of the implications of that are that tends to establish the relationship that you have with that supplier. And whilst there is always a place for that type of negotiation, if you're trying to establish longer term strategic collaborative relationships, then actually this more distributive approach, where you use traditional tactics like high ball, low ball, good cop, bad cop, things like that, that may not result in those longer term benefits. And a lot of the supply chain management literature would say we derive significant benefits from collaborative relationships with at least some suppliers, not all suppliers. The alternative view is one that's more integrative, more collaborative, and actually where we work together, so buyer and supplier work together to try and solve problems, try and solve issues with a view of we both win from this negotiation. But as I was looking at this, and particularly with my background in industry, in procurement, is actually trying to understand what happens in that middle part of the negotiation. So what really happens when people are in that room, bargaining with each other, discussing with each other? What do they need to prepare for that? What do they do in that actual meeting or meetings? Because, of course, negotiations can go on for a reasonably long period of time. And how do they consider the outcomes of that? And what it struck me was actually there wasn't a particularly clear perspective of what that is. There was lots of bits of fragmented research, and also research from lots of different fields. So my main field is broadly within operations and supply chain management, which is where procurement or purchasing and supply management would tend to fit. But actually, there's research from, let's say, law. There's research, if it's to do with AI, from computer science. There's research from psychology as well. And so we took this opportunity to try and bring that literature together, because when we were looking at, what do we mean by bargaining, and that, as I said, that more focused element of communication, of actual discussions, we tended to see three broad but sometimes overlapping definitions. So I think when we use the word bargaining, it's often seen as haggling, which is a specific approach to negotiation, very much associated with that distributive or that more adversarial approach. We also saw it as being relatively narrow, and it's about reaching agreement over a narrower range of variables and requirements, often price. And that actually this couldn't be used in more complex negotiations. But then I think back to my own time, and even where we were buying complex products or complex services, we were still having that back and forth discussion with suppliers. We also see it as a specific stage in the negotiation process. So that stage where you've prepared for the negotiation, and the words that you say first, you open with an offer, then there's a counter offer, then there's various bargaining, and then an agreement is raised. So all of that then suggested there was an opportunity for us to do a literature review, because one of the key outcomes of a literature review is to try and synthesize various parts of literature, particularly if they're coming from different fields of study, into something that was more coherent. What we also wanted to do was to go deeper than that distributive and integrative divide, because we felt that was overly simplistic. And we also, again, partly based on my own experience and also a small amount of literature, was that actually organizations and individuals may start with one approach, but then move to another. And so that didn't seem particularly helpful then in thinking of it in those terms. So our aim then was to develop a conceptual model and to identify different constructs and variables associated with those constructs to try and make a real contribution to negotiation theory more broadly. But of course, as with virtually all academic research now, we're under not an obligation, but a need to provide insights for practitioners, which again we've done, and I'll discuss those towards the end. But also from my own background, being an ex-practitioner, I thought this was particularly useful, and that led us to generate three main research questions. So the first one is looking at the main theoretical and methodological trends in purchasing and supply management bargaining research. But our two key ones really are research question 2 and research question 3. So what are the constructs and the measures used to define bargaining? And so we've created essentially a list of those, and I'll show them in this presentation. If you want more details on them, they're available in the paper, and I'll just highlight one or two that I think were particularly interesting for us. And then also we wanted to try and bring those together into a model that tries to interrelate and show them and show some positions of them. And what we've done is we've divided that and separated that into areas of control, whether it's the individual or the overall organizational team, or a mixture of the two, which we thought was a logical way of doing that. For those that have done literature reviews or experienced them, you may well have come across this particular approach. This is a very well used one in certainly business and management research by Denyer and Tranfield. There are others, of course, available. So there's one by Soaring. There's also those in other areas like the Prisma technique. Broadly, they're doing similar things, to be honest. And the real purpose of it is that you can demonstrate rigor and replicability. So if somebody was to do this again using all of the data that you've got and all of the search terms, would they get the same results? That's one of the main purposes of it. So I won't talk too much about the methodology, but we used multiple databases to try and minimize bias to make sure that we covered all the literature. We used the search terms that are shown there to try and build up a picture, a full picture of actually what was going on in this phenomenon of bargaining within the negotiation process. What was interesting is part of the review process for this journal, we were asked to extend those search terms. So in the first version, we had a smaller number of those. And actually that was really useful because they brought in things like contract theory, for example, as a way to pick up different papers and articles. So that search then generated just under 2,800 papers, which is too many for even two people to read. And this was before the time of artificial intelligence being able to do some of this for me, although that's an interesting methodological aspect. So we did a review of those just to remove any duplicates because we were using multiple databases, and also some that were outside of the scope of our focus, which was on business to business bargaining between those two types of organizations. And that generated that second search generated 427 papers, which is still quite a lot as well. I've listed up there just for completeness to show some of the exclusion criteria. So these are papers that are picked up by the search, but actually aren't directly relevant. So we did still pick up for example, a number of consumer papers. It did, because it's got the word bargain asterisks in, pick up those that were looking at bargains, i.e. a cheap deal, with things that, again, didn't actually go through and discuss it more fully. And there was also a number of papers that it was only really referred to as a recommendation. So they've been looking at something else. It might have been, let's say, developing relationships, and it was, well, this could help in the bargaining process or something like that. But it wasn't really focused on that. So what we did with those 427 papers is essentially downloaded them, put them into a big spreadsheet, and then started to analyze them and categorize them. And so some of the criteria we were looking for was whether they used a theory, a particular theory, what method they used. So whether that was primarily either quantitative, qualitative, and then the subcategories of those. We did also look at the industry that the negotiation was being explored within. It actually didn't particularly come up with any meaningful insights, too much from that. But the key things for us, we were looking at the construct. So what is the particular focus of this research? What are they trying to understand? And what were the measures of that construct? And so, as an example, a number of the papers looked at what those top two are, which is about size. So that's the amount of effectively money or value you have within the negotiation. So if you're, let's say, Siemens, for example, then huge company, very well organized in terms of centralizing activity, to a certain extent, group buying as well. So was able to generate bargaining power and negotiation power over their suppliers because it was spending so much money. Interestingly, though, jumping ahead a little bit to the findings, there were some contradictory findings on that. So I think our natural assumption is you spend more money, you get a cheaper price. But actually, in some instances, that didn't seem to be the case. And so some of the research suggests that actually it was not particularly valuable to do that, which is what we put. We're not attempting to solve these problems in this review, but we put as an area that should be researched into further. And then a couple of the others that came out. So as we're analysing the data, different constructs start to emerge from that. So things like information, the key role of information, and also tactics. So what tactics were being used, and within those, so these are the headline constructs. What we did was then broke them down a little bit further, which is on the next slide. Two of the more descriptive findings that, and particularly the second one, we use more to inform our suggestions for future research, was that it's an upward trajectory of research, which is interesting, which is good for us in this paper, as it shows that it's still a valuable area to research, and also that actually it's been around for quite a long time. In terms, the earliest papers were actually in the 70s. We couldn't locate some of those because of the age of papers, but we're certainly starting to see far more research being done on how artificial intelligence can be used in the negotiation process. We also looked at the different methods, and what we found was that the vast majority of them used modeling techniques. So they were more experimental papers, primarily looking at price as a variable. So saying what's the best approach to negotiating price in a modeling context. In terms of the constructs that we identified, so again, I know that's a really busy slide, but I wanted to sort of put it up there. Obviously, I've talked a little bit about purchasing volume, the amount of spend. So some of the ways in which organizations can increase their advantage in a bargaining situation is obviously increasing the spend, aggregating volume from different parts of the organization. There was quite a bit of research around the information available. And one of the things I certainly found when I was a practitioner was, firstly, we never had enough time to prepare for bargaining situations. And there is again, it is a bit of a cliche that you should spend roughly 4 times the amount of time on preparation than you do actually in that bargaining situation. And not that we were lazy, of course, but it was just the pressures of doing lots of other things like other negotiations or contract finalization or supplier selection. But what was interesting, there was actually a lot of different dimensions of information there. So it was the amount of it, it was the availability of it in terms of timing, also the quality of it. What was an interesting one, which again, not wholly surprising, was levels of asymmetry. So whether a buying organization had more information than the supplier, which can be quite challenging, of course, because the suppliers are the ones who make those products or produce those services that they had. We also saw a range of different variables being negotiated. Unsurprisingly, things like price was a key thing. An area of focus, particularly for the bargaining meeting itself, was the tactics being used. So we saw research that looked at different pricing approaches. We saw research that looked at the number of suppliers being actually bargained with and the order with which you negotiate with those suppliers. So whether you go for the one that you think you can get the best deal from first, or leave them till last, for example. There was quite a bit of research around the use of technology. And because this research, the data was probably 2022 that we were starting to do it, because the time taken to get academic research published, the main technology there was about online auctions rather than artificial intelligence. There was some. There is more around artificial intelligence now, which again would make, if we were to do this now, make this look a little bit different. I think one thing that we were not surprised about, but we didn't think we would encounter, was about the level of effort expended in the bargaining process. So if the other person saw that you were making an effort, that could lead to more beneficial outcomes, I think. So that's partly around the negotiation style that people adopt. What was not wholly surprising in the sense that empirical primary data from negotiations is quite difficult to get hold of, primarily for confidentiality reasons. So if you were to try and contact a company and to say, can I come and observe a negotiation that you're doing, that they're unlikely to do that. I have observed some negotiations in some of the research that I've done, but it was difficult to get access. But what we shouldn't forget about negotiation, and I think actually certainly the modeling research does underemphasize this because of its very nature, is that negotiations are, at least currently, take place between humans and between individuals. And that actually there was a real need to do more research on individual characteristics. So that's things like the level of risk appetite. What about age, gender, cultural aspects, and the skill levels used? And there isn't much research around this, particularly around age and gender. It was, and what there was quite old. But actually, that's a really interesting area, and there's an opportunity then to bring in some of other research, particularly around personality types from maybe organizational behavior research or psychology into that approach. And then the final one, again, was a bit surprising, was the amount and the differences with which the outcomes of that bargaining were considered. So there's the obvious one in that, have you met your objectives? So in a simplified example would be, well, we think that, or we can only spend €1,000 on a particular product. Did we meet that target? Did we get it by the date that we expected and that we needed it by? So those tend to be measured, and again, from my experience though, not in the systematic way, because there's very little time for reflection of negotiation outcomes. So it would be beneficial to have to at least keep track and say, well, we started with this objective, and this is what we ended up with. And I think that would be really useful for organizations, because it would allow them to think about their tactics when they negotiate. But also, there's very little, I mean, there's a bit of research on it, but from my experience, not so much tracking of it from an organizational sense. And of course, organizations will be different, but it's how much time is spent on the bargaining process, because of course that's resources, that's expenditure, but also what's the level of impact on the ensuing relationship. So if you think about a supply relationship as in the sense of time, negotiations and particularly bargaining are right at the early stage of that relationship. So the words that you use, the tactics, the strategies that you use at that early stage undoubtedly affect what happens at a later stage. And if there's a mismatch, being too adversarial in the negotiation phase versus actually I want a really collaborative relationship with my supplier, that may create challenges. So that's what we did in terms of a very lengthy analysis of each of those papers, establishing what's the construct and what's the measure and the variable of that, was to put them together into a coherent model. And we thought of a few different ways of doing this. But actually, because we were really looking, or one aspect we were looking for was to actually help practitioners. We broke it down into organizational control levels. So at the bottom in green, we've got at the individual level. So if I was a buyer, what influence do I have? What can I control in that bargaining process? And it's things like, what tactics do I use? So we've talked about the order in which you can negotiate, what variables and the order within I introduce those variables. How do I make trade-offs, for example? It could be a way of deploying individual characteristics like skill levels, for example, that we have. Then we've got those in yellow, which are mixed between that organizational departmental level, where the individual has either zero control or very, very little control. And it could be things like deciding tactics. So that's probably a joint decision between individuals, because obviously they're, depending on their seniority, left to their own devices in a negotiation. And also departmental managers, for example, that are involved in training and assessing performance and things like that. And then at the top level, things like generating purchasing volume. So as an individual can't really influence how much money is spent by the organization. Now, of course, activities like aggregating volume, centralizing contracts, moving to a single supplier rather than multiple suppliers. Again, individuals have some element of control over that, but fundamentally, you can't change. Your organization has a requirement and a certain amount of money to spend. Now, it might have flexibility on when it spends that money, of course, which could be seen as a tactic. So that was our aim with that, was to group this together into something meaningful, both for academics, but this one particularly for practitioners, I think. And so from that, we generated a number of practice-based recommendations. Again, the full list is in the paper, and I've touched on some of them already. Is again potentially generating bargaining power by bundling spend requirements, possibly joining consortia. Certainly, that's something we did when I worked at Siemens. The absolute clear value of high quality information. Again, as technology develops, it improves. Certainly looking at the use of large language models and AI more broadly in negotiation. A number of the research areas and also some of the solutions being offered help in the evaluation of information. So things like, how much do I spend? What's the supply market look like? What's the relative power of a particular supplier in a negotiation? clear strategy over which suppliers to approach and what order. Again, from my experience, that was very haphazard and not quite random, but almost that. Also thinking about the mixes of negotiating teams, and partly because there's very little research on that, I think it's challenging for organisations to think about that. And just to finish, interesting, the final one about supplier perspectives. So, what does a supplier think about this negotiation and this bargaining activity? And of course, there is a more recent focus on supplier perspectives. So how do we make ourselves as a buying organization more attractive to suppliers? What can we do? Because of course, if we're Siemens or something like that, we would consider ourselves at that time, we would be fair and equitable with suppliers. But we were spending so much money, and we had a good image and a good brand in various marketplaces, particularly business to business. But what about smaller organizations? Because we potentially could be competing with other buyers for the same products and the same services. So how do we make sure that we're competitive? How do we make sure that actually we can satisfy our supply requirements? So just to finish up then, in terms of future research, clear area, more empirical research needs to be done. And I think whilst I've already mentioned some of the practical challenges of getting data from about negotiation for confidentiality reasons, I think there is an opportunity to do experimental research, for example, maybe using groups of students or groups of practitioners and looking at some of those individual characteristics. So what about the order with which we negotiate? What about some of the tactics that we use? What influence does individual characteristics have on the negotiation process? I still think there is contradictory research on the role of organizational and size. I think there's still opportunity to draw on research in other areas, not just what we've looked at in terms of bargaining, because negotiation is widely explored in other contexts, consumer behavior, for example, politics, trade unions, in legal research. And also, I think a much clearer understanding of the role of, particularly of artificial intelligence in the negotiation progress, because actually that's primarily focused on the bargaining aspect, and it's being used already. Walmart use a software package for their commodity items, lower value items, for example. So we're starting to see this, and I think, as with any technology, and I think AI maybe more than others, has got significant opportunities in this area. Some things that we're doing as well. So we're obviously, as researchers into this area, so we've done a number of things. Obviously, we have a journal paper that is published in 2024 on group decision negotiation. We've done a number of presentations, both to practice, so Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply in the UK, similar ones to this. So I've presented research at a number of UK universities, in Lapland as well, and obviously with yourselves in conjunction with the Warsaw University of Technology Business School. But we're also developing a continuous professional development training mini module on it, which has a practitioner manual. And from our perspective, in terms of our future research, now that we've established it, that we are going to do more empirical studies, particularly using experiments and trying to isolate some of those constructs and variables as well. So, conscious I've probably got a few minutes over my allocated 30-ish minutes. The link is there for the journal paper, but it's easily locatable. So you can see it on my Google Scholar profile, for example. If you just go to the journal, it's there as well. So I'll stop sharing my screen and throw this open to any questions. So please feel free to put them in the chat. As I said, thank you very much for listening. I'll put my email address into the chat as well, just in case. So if there's suddenly something you think I should have asked during the session, then just get in touch with me. That's absolutely fine. I'll also, so you've got it to hand, I'll put the link to the paper itself in the chat. So I'll leave it a couple of minutes if people want to type questions. Thank you there. Thank you, Jersey. Thank you. Oh, great. We've got a press. Matthias, key steps keep in mind. If you find yourself in the typical short-term distributive negotiation, but your wish is to really turn it into a more win-win situation, thereby establish a better relationship with supplier. Fantastic question, Matthias. Yeah. What's really, again, just before I get on to deal with the question itself, is, as I mentioned at the start, I run a lot of negotiation role plays where groups are divided into buyers and suppliers, and they get a short one-page briefing that they can look as a group, and then they come and negotiate. And I tell them about those. I mean, some are more experienced in negotiation than others, but I tell them about those broad approaches, distributive versus integrative approaches. But I don't tell them which they should adopt. Both can generate results, both can generate successful outcomes. Virtually all groups start with a distributive approach, very much as you've made the point, Matthias, there. Virtually all start with a distributive approach, and it's often based on price. That's 9 times out of 10. They start with an offer about price, and if they're the buyer, they go low, and if they're the supplier, they go high. And I understand that, because I think that's our traditional approach to negotiation. I think if you were to ask somebody, what do you mean by negotiation, they would think of that. So what happens when trying to bring that back into a more integrative approach? So there's a number of different techniques associated with the integrative approach. I mean, the primary one, which, as with a lot of these things, is simple in concept but actually difficult in practice, is to try and separate out what the actual interests of the other party are. What are their motivations? What are their fears? What are their drivers? Separate that out from the words that they are saying. Because if you understand that, then you can probably be more empathetic. You can put yourself into their shoes. One of the ways of doing that is more about active listening. And it's trying to separate the person from the negotiation. So whilst obviously individuals will negotiate with different styles and different approaches, it's trying to listen. What are they actually telling me in terms of this negotiation? And I can remember from experience of negotiating with, and I used to buy software, and software is an interesting category of spend because it's not tangible. So there's no physical cost associated. Roughly, there is a small one associated with how many units you sell, because all the costs primarily are in the development of that software. There is some obviously in maintaining it and fixing bugs and things like that. And so we used to negotiate with a supplier, quite a few suppliers, quite regularly for that category of spend. And it was always very adversarial with those suppliers. And sometimes we were successful, sometimes we felt we weren't particularly successful. And one of the things it took a bit of time to work out was actually, which was obvious in hindsight, we look back at it, you think this was obvious, but it was actually their primary driver was meeting either individual or organizational sales targets. So whether that's monthly or quarterly or annually. And what we were experiencing then was, and if we'd had better preparation or better tracking of this, we probably would have realized earlier, was that actually at certain periods of time, they would react in certain ways to the negotiation because they needed to hit their targets. And what they were really looking for from us was flexibility, because it didn't actually, within certain parameters, didn't actually matter when we bought those licenses. We had to buy them within our financial year because of accounting rules. But actually it didn't really matter whether it was month 3 or month 6, to be honest. But it did have a significant effect on them. And it was only over time, because we started to listen really to what they were saying and start to be a bit more emphatic about them, that actually we started to work more jointly with those. But I think, again, going back to your question, Matthias, I think if we start out with, I think if we've given ourselves time to prepare, because if we don't have a lot of time, I think we then fall into default behavior of, for example, I'm just going to focus on price, and I'm just going to say, I want the lowest price possible. But actually, if we've got a full understanding, while price will always be important, if we've got a fuller understanding of actually what do we really need from this? For example, do we need a long-term relationship with this supplier? That, I think, would make us, at least from a buying organization, go into the negotiation in a particular way. And again, I think from my experience, I think that actually buying organizations are often the ones who start this adversarial process. I'm not sure that always, some suppliers will do, but in the main, it's from the buying organization. Is that okay, Matthias? Does that make sense? So if you're typing, I'll jump to Adrian's comment. Thank you, Adrian. Interested that more consideration now been given to the supplier perspective. Thank you, Matthias. Yep, absolutely. Wondering what your views are on the extent to which negotiation is a skill that is innate versus a skill that is learned, please. Yeah, brilliant question, Adrian. Yeah. So, I mean, there's lots of research on soft skills, how much you can teach certain skills. Interestingly, I did some previous research on purchasing and supply management skills as part of a large EU-funded project. And we were looking at current skills and future skills. And negotiation was one of the few that appeared in the top 10 of either of those skill sets that they have. My personal view, and again, it's in some ways, I suppose, a deeper psychological question, isn't it? I think there is some element of personality plays a part. And often when I'm doing the role play with people, particularly with school children, because by their nature they can be a little bit more anxious and nervous about things. I think that there is a feeling that the best negotiators are extroverts, and that they're loud and that they can shout a lot. Whereas actually the best negotiator I ever worked for was somebody at Siemens, who generated consistently the best outcomes from our negotiation group, if you like, or our procurement team. He was very quiet. He was introverted. But what he did very well was he listened very well. And so he would never lose his temper, never shout, anything like that. But he would actively listen. And so going back to my response to Matthias's question about particular tactics, actually that's a key aspect of a more integrative approach to negotiations. So I would always say, negotiation, procurement as a whole, and also negotiation fits with a lot of different personality types. But also, I think if you look at some of those some of the constructs there, so it's about some of those around use of information, for example, the order with which you negotiate with suppliers, how you deploy your tactics in that negotiation. I mean, that can be learnt and that can be developed. I mean, it's partly about how organized as a person you are, time management, and all of those things. But I think there's a lot of that actually is forgotten about. And certainly, my experience starting out negotiating was very culturally driven. The first organization I worked for was very adversarial. It was a manufacturing company. And so I'd come at it from, I'm old enough before to have been at university before there was many specific purchasing and supply management courses. So my first degree is actually in law. So I really didn't have a clue about negotiating. And so in my first negotiation, I turned to the person next to me and said, well, what do I do? He said, just get the best price. And actually, that then informed, at least to begin with, my approach to negotiation. And that was culturally driven by that negotiation. Then I went to work for different companies and it was different, I think. So I think it's both. And I think negotiation, different tactics can generate success. And I suppose, going back to there's Mateus's point, there is a place for distributive negotiations. So if you're just buying a one-off product, and for anybody who's studied purchasing and supply management, there's a well-known tool called Crix Matrix, which divides categories of spend according to their importance and the supply market dynamics. And there is an element, a quadrant of that looks at items that you don't buy very often, and or they're not that important, and or there's lots of suppliers out there, stationery, for example, for most companies. So you can probably adopt a distributive approach with that. But that's not going to be the same if you're working for a car manufacturing company and the supplier who makes your engines or something like that. And again, reflect on Mateus's point that the first company I worked for, we adopted that adversarial approach with every single supplier. Didn't matter whether we should be having a 10-year strategic relationship with them, or we were just buying a photocopier or a pack of pens from them. We adopted that approach, and that wasn't very successful. It caused us lots of problems, not with the company we were buying pens from, but the other strategic suppliers. So I think there probably is a more nuanced approach to training in different negotiation settings. And I guess there will be an element that people will often gravitate towards those that they feel they can be more successful at, of course. So there's often differences between services procurement and tangible goods procurement as well. That, again, you might need to be more, let's say, quantitatively orientated if you're buying components, because you're dealing with spend data and pricing, and looking at forecasts and possibly modeling the outcomes of those forecasts. Whereas services, because it's more difficult to establish what your requirements are, may require a more relational approach. So it'll be a combination of people probably gravitate more to those, find they're successful, stay in those, etc. With things. But also, again, just to finish up on where I've been talking on this point for about 10 minutes, Adrian, hopefully it's useful, is that from my experience, and I think things will be better now, that actually people in procurement don't often get negotiation training. And as an example, the only negotiation training I ever got was from a company that delivered sales training. And it was actually really interesting because it was the sales perspective on negotiation. There are a lot of similarities, of course, in terms of what you're trying to do. I think that is better now, and there is more, we teach a lot more negotiation on our courses here at the University of Salford, for example. And SIPS, as an example, as an association, do more on negotiation. Has that helped, Adrian? That's my somewhat long-winded answer to that question. I don't think I got to a definitive point. Brilliant. Thank you, Adrian. So I think we've got a couple more minutes, but we're nearly due to finish. Any final questions? Another one from Mateus. In what way do you think AI may transform the way corporations work with procurement? Yeah, really good question, Mateus. Interestingly, I've just done a literature review on the use of AI in negotiation. And to be actually, I presented at a conference I was at last week in a purchasing conference in the Netherlands. And actually, I was a bit disappointed with the findings, because I thought there'd be far more research out there into AI. I know I was focused on negotiation. There is much more in the broader procurement sense. So there is, for example, solutions that, as I mentioned, do spend analyses and analyze categories, for example. There is business to business negotiation that happens through AI. So Walmart, I gave as an example. Its usage is currently restricted more to, as I said, those simpler items that price and probably delivery are the key variables, quality aspects as well, but not those more complex areas that they have. There is some in contract negotiation and contract completion, and some really good examples from the construction industry, because as well as other industries, but construction industry relies heavily on contracts, and there's lots of them. So you think of the amount of subcontractors that's in a construction supply chain, and obviously they all want to make sure that they're not taking on any more liability for lateness, overruns, quality issues than they need to. So there is software currently available that analyzes contract terms and tries to synthesize those, which I think is a really interesting area of research. But the ones I found on negotiation, similar to this, there was a lot of modeling research, and a lot of that was basically saying the model that we've created does better than another model at generating outcomes. There was some that says it does it better than a human. Again, relatively narrow parameters, price mainly, and a maybe smaller number of variables. But that tended to be it really. There was interestingly some that looked at again individual characteristics. So things, because of course using AI in conjunction with other sensors, for example, so like body sensors, looking at body language, which again I didn't particularly mention in this presentation, but is of course a really interesting area of research. Again, surprisingly, not very much within this field, this bargaining field, and what there was tended to be quite general. So that I think is a really interesting area of looking at body language. But I think it's fairly early days, Matthias, on that. And I think if I were to, let's say, do that literature review in another 2 years, I would hope there would be much more tangible research in that area. But I think, yeah, I mean, if you want to look at, there's some good examples on the UK SIPS, Chartered Institute of Procurement Supply website. And so you do need membership to get access to some resources, but they've got some that are publicly available, and they have got some looking at AI in procurement as well, but only because I was looking at it the other day to prepare for my presentation. So that gives a sort of split between some of the different AI, because of course AI is that umbrella term, isn't it, about using that in terms of research. Is that okay, Matthias? But you can always ping me an email, because it's an area I'm really interested in, not just in negotiation, but AI usage more generally in procurement, and even broaden that in sort of operations as well. So, but brilliant. Thank you very much for your questions, Matthias, and to Adrian. So I think according to my time, it's 6 o'clock Warsaw time, 5 o'clock for me here in the UK. So all that remains is huge thank you for attending. Thank you for all the questions. As I said, I put my email into the chat box. So just let me know if you've got any questions. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm Dr. Steve Kelly on LinkedIn if you want to connect on that. And a big thanks to Krasnia and also Susanna as well for organising this and let me come to speak to you. I hope you found it useful and interesting.